Victor Harrington leaned back in his velvet chair, a glass of aged scotch swirling lazily in his hand. Around him, the cacophony of laughter and chatter filled the grandiose penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The party was his, another extravagance to flaunt his wealth and keep his so-called friends entertained. It was all part of the game, a game he had mastered. "Come on, Vic," drawled Carter, his longtime friend and equal in shallowness. "When are you gonna do something actually shocking? Buy another sports car? Yawn. Marry a stranger? Now that'd be something to talk about." The table erupted in laughter, but Victor's smirk didn't falter. He thrived on dares and absurdity, knowing his wealth cushioned him from real consequences. "Oh, I could do that," he replied, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Carter leaned closer, his grin turning devious. "I'll make it easy for you. What about her?" He gestured toward a woman on the other side of the room, Amara Daniels. Amara was an enigma at this party. Dressed elegantly but modestly, she radiated confidence in a sea of pretense. She wasn't there for the glamour. Her goal was to pitch her startup idea to a few influential investors. Her presence was as purposeful as it was out of place. Victor chuckled, his interest piqued. "Her? Really? She's not my type." "Exactly why you should," Carter teased. "Unless you're scared." The room roared with encouragement, egging Victor on. He never backed down from a challenge, and tonight would be no different. "Fine," he said, standing and draining his glass. "Watch and learn." He crossed the room with practiced charm, his tailored suit and self-assured swagger parting the crowd like the Red Sea. Amara glanced up as he approached, her eyes guarded but polite. "Victor Harrington," he introduced himself, his tone smooth. "I couldn't help but notice someone with actual class at this circus. May I join you?" Amara hesitated but nodded, always aware of potential networking opportunities. "Amara Daniels, what brings you to your own party?" Victor laughed, pretending her sharp wit had struck him. "Touché. Truth is, I was looking for someone worth talking to. Lucky me, I found you." Their conversation flowed easily. Victor, skilled in the art of persuasion, presented himself as intrigued by her work and supportive of her ambitions. Amara, though cautious, found herself drawn to his apparent sincerity. By the end of the night, Victor's charm had disarmed her enough to suggest dinner. "I know it's sudden," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, "but I think we have something special. Why wait to find out?" The whirlwind continued the next day. Victor whisked Amara away in his sleek sports car, driving to a small but opulent chapel he'd rented for the occasion. Amara's head spun with disbelief, but Victor's charisma carried her along like a tide. He spoke of serendipity, fate, and a life of adventure together. "I know it's crazy," Victor admitted, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt almost real. "But don't all the best things in life start with a leap of faith?" Her instinct screamed caution, but there was something intoxicating about his conviction. Before she fully grasped what was happening, they were exchanging vows in front of an ordained officiant. As the ceremony concluded, Victor slipped a diamond ring onto her finger, a gaudy, dazzling piece that weighed heavily on her hand. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to believe in the fantasy. But behind Victor's confident smile was a darker truth. Hours earlier, he had returned to his circle of friends, bragging about his plan. "By tomorrow," he'd said with a laugh, "I'll have her thinking she's Cinderella. Just wait." The ink on the marriage certificate had barely dried when Victor excused himself to take a call. Out of earshot, his voice dropped into a tone of indifference. "It's done," he told Carter. "You owe me dinner at Le Bernardin. And don't forget, top shelf." As Victor rejoined Amara, taking her hand with a smile that could light up the room, she felt a flicker of uncertainty in her gut. She had no idea she'd just become the center of a cruel joke, or that the man standing beside her would soon regret ever playing it. The morning light filtered through the grand windows of Victor's penthouse, casting an ethereal glow on the minimalist decor. Amara sat alone at the dining table, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup. She should have felt like a newlywed in a dream. Instead, unease gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. Victor strolled in, his casual confidence unmistakable. Dressed impeccably in tailored slacks and a crisp shirt, he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "Morning, Mrs. Harrington," he said with a grin, planting a kiss on her temple. Amara managed a polite smile. "Morning. Early meeting today?" Victor poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate, as though every gesture was a performance. "Something like that. You don't have to worry about all that business stuff now, though. Relax and enjoy being spoiled. That's my job now." His words were sweet, but they rang hollow. Amara knew better than to take things at face value, especially in a world where appearances often masked ulterior motives. Still, she couldn't pinpoint why she felt like the ground beneath her was unstable. Later that evening, her suspicions found their root. Amara hadn't intended to eavesdrop. She was returning from the study, where she'd been researching potential partnerships for her startup. Victor was in his private lounge, a place she hadn't yet been invited to. His voice carried through the slightly ajar door, laughter uncovering his words. "I can't believe you actually did it," Carter's voice drawled. "Married her, just like that." Victor's chuckle followed, sharp and unfeeling. "It's hilarious. You should have seen her face, so serious, like she thought it was all real. She'll figure it out eventually, but for now, I've got her exactly where I want her." The blood drained from Amara's face. She stood frozen, each word cutting deeper than the last. Her mind reeled as she pieced together the truth. This wasn't serendipity. This wasn't love. It was a joke, a cruel, calculated game to boost his ego at her expense. She backed away from the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. In the privacy of the guest room Victor had set up as her home office, Amara slumped into a chair, her hands trembling. The humiliation burned, but so did the fury beneath it. She had worked tirelessly for everything she had, her education, her business, her reputation, and now she'd been reduced to the punchline of some rich boy's joke. When Victor returned that night, he found her seated on the couch, her expression calm but distant. "You're still up," he remarked, loosening his tie. "I couldn't sleep," Amara replied, her voice steady. "Too much to think about." Victor flopped down beside her, draping an arm over the back of the couch. "You're overthinking it. All that stress from your startup, it's time to leave that behind. I told you, you're Mrs. Harrington now. Let me handle everything." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him. She wanted to scream, to call him out, to demand why he'd done this. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd broken her. "Not yet." "Victor," she said slowly, her voice laced with a sharp edge he didn't seem to notice, "I appreciate that, but I've never been one to rely on anyone. It's not who I am." Victor chuckled, brushing off her words. "That's adorable. But seriously, relax. You'll see, this is all for the best." Amara nodded faintly, masking the fire building within her. He might have fooled her into thinking this marriage was real, but she wasn't a pawn in his game. If he thought she'd crumble under the weight of his betrayal, he had underestimated her. The next few days were a delicate balancing act. Amara played the role of the dutiful wife in public, smiling and nodding through social events where Victor paraded her like a trophy. But behind the scenes, she worked tirelessly to gather information. Her suspicions led her to Victor's business dealings. Late at night, while he slept soundly, she pored over documents and spreadsheets in his home office, searching for something, anything, that would give her leverage. Victor's arrogance had blinded him to her capabilities, and she intended to use that to her advantage. One night, as she sifted through another file, her eyes widened. An anomaly in the financial records caught her attention. Misallocated funds, hidden accounts, a trail of discrepancies that hinted at something much larger than Victor's personal vanity. She leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. Victor's betrayal had hurt, but what she'd found could ruin more than just her pride. It could destroy countless lives. Her path forward had suddenly become clear. The morning was unusually quiet in the Harrington penthouse. Victor had left early for a meeting, and Amara was grateful for the solitude. She sat at the long marble counter, her laptop open to a spreadsheet she'd pulled from Victor's company files. The anomalies weren't just a mistake, they were deliberate. Someone was siphoning money into shell accounts, and the scale suggested systemic corruption. Amara's fingers hovered over the keyboard as her thoughts raced. It wasn't just about her anymore. If she exposed this, it could prevent a looming disaster for Victor's employees, investors, and partners. But doing so could also drag her into the chaos, or worse, make her a target. She closed her laptop with a resolute snap. Victor might see her as a pawn, but she wasn't about to play by his rules. That evening, Victor announced they'd be attending a gala, another social obligation where he'd parade her around. Amara didn't protest. If there was one thing she had learned about high society, it was that appearances were everything. She would play the part he expected of her, but on her terms. The gala was a glittering affair held in a historic mansion. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the sound of string instruments filled the air. Amara wore a sleek black gown that hugged her figure, a far cry from the modest wardrobe she'd chosen in the past. Tonight, she wanted to command attention, and it worked. As they entered, the room seemed to shift. Heads turned, whispers spread. Amara held her chin high, the diamond necklace Victor had given her glinting like armor under the lights. Victor leaned down, his hand possessively on her waist. "You look stunning," he murmured, his tone low and admiring. Amara smiled tightly, her eyes scanning the room. "Thank you. It's nice to be seen." The tension between them was palpable, though Victor seemed oblivious. His charm flowed freely as he introduced her to his circle, most of whom greeted her with thinly veiled condescension. When Carter approached, Amara's heart burned with quiet fury. He clapped Victor on the back, his laughter grating. "Well, look at you two. The happy couple." "Couldn't be happier," Victor replied smoothly, his arm tightening around Amara. Amara turned to Carter with a disarming smile. "It's funny, isn't it? How life can surprise you. You never really know someone's true motives." Victor stiffened slightly, his smile faltering, but Carter didn't notice. He chuckled and turned the conversation to himself, giving Amara a moment to revel in the discomfort she'd caused. Later that night, as Victor mingled, Amara found herself drawn to the edge of the room, away from the crowd. A man approached her, one of the few investors she recognized from her previous pitches. "Mrs. Harrington," he greeted warmly. "Quite the event. Tell me, how's your business venture coming along?" Amara blinked, surprised by his directness. "It's a work in progress," she admitted, grateful for the distraction. He nodded. "I've been following your journey. I must say, you're a rare presence in this circle, someone who's actually earned their place. If you ever need advice or resources, don't hesitate to reach out." His sincerity caught her off guard. For the first time that evening, she felt seen for who she truly was. "Thank you," she said softly, tucking his card into her clutch. The car ride home was silent, the tension between her and Victor thick enough to cut. He finally broke the quiet as they pulled into the garage. "You've been quiet tonight," he remarked, his tone laced with curiosity. "Just thinking," Amara replied, stepping out of the car before he could press further. Upstairs, she retreated to her office, her mind a whirlwind of strategies. Victor wouldn't stop her from reclaiming her agency. Her next steps were clear. She needed more evidence of the financial discrepancies and a way to expose them without implicating herself. The following day, Amara prepared to visit one of Victor's company offices under the guise of curiosity about his work. He indulged her request with a dismissive wave, confident that she wouldn't uncover anything of value. At the office, Amara charmed the staff, asking innocent questions and learning about their roles. She quietly observed the operations, taking mental notes of inefficiencies and irregularities. One name kept coming up in conversations, a high-level executive who seemed to have undue influence over decisions. That evening, she confronted Victor about the executive, masking her inquiry as casual curiosity. "Who's Lawrence Halstead?" she asked over dinner. Victor raised an eyebrow. "He's one of my top guys." "Why?" "No reason," Amara replied with a small smile. "I just heard his name a lot today. He seems important." Victor shrugged, clearly uninterested in her musings. "He's good at what he does. Keeps things running smoothly." Amara nodded, filing the information away. Victor might trust Halstead, but her instincts told her otherwise. As the days passed, Amara's confidence grew. She worked late into the night, compiling evidence and planning her next move. Her goal wasn't just to expose Victor's betrayal. It was to ensure her own survival and success in a world that had tried to break her. Victor, meanwhile, began to notice her distance. One night, he cornered her in the living room, his frustration finally boiling over. "You've been acting different," he said, his voice low. "What's going on, Amara?" She met his gaze calmly, her expression unreadable. "I'm just finding my place, Victor. Isn't that what you wanted?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. As he walked away, Amara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Victor might think he held the power, but she was no longer the naive woman he'd duped. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and soon, she would be ready to make her move. Amara adjusted the pendant on her necklace, a small, discreet recorder hidden within the ornate design. She had worn it to her second tour of Victor's company headquarters, her calm demeanor masking the storm within. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was actively gathering evidence. Lawrence Halstead's name had continued to surface during her quiet investigation. He was the keystone in Victor's financial empire, or so it seemed. Amara's instincts told her he wasn't just influential, he was dangerous. The day's pivotal moment came during a tense exchange she overheard between Halstead and another executive. Amara lingered near an open office door, pretending to read a company brochure. "We can't afford to leave a trail," Halstead was saying, his voice clipped. "If the auditors catch wind of this, we're sunk. Everything depends on this merger." "But the accounts," the executive began. "I'll handle the accounts," Halstead snapped. "Just make sure Victor stays in the dark. He's too distracted with his little trophy wife to notice anyway." Amara's breath hitched. Her hand instinctively tightened on the necklace pendant. It wasn't just Victor's arrogance that had blinded him. His inner circle was actively exploiting him. The stakes had just risen. This wasn't about Victor's betrayal anymore. It was about exposing the entire scheme before it destroyed countless lives. That evening, Amara sat in her office, the recorder on the desk before her. She played back the conversation she'd captured, her expression grim as she transcribed every word. Halstead's voice crackled through the small device, the tension in his tone palpable. She now had proof of fraud and conspiracy, but it wasn't enough to act on yet. To bring down Halstead, and by extension, Victor's company, she needed to tie the illegal activities to specific accounts and transactions. Her mind raced, crafting a plan. Victor, oblivious to her late-night efforts, lounged in the living room, scrolling through his phone. His routine had barely changed, though Amara noticed him watching her more closely these days. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked casually as she passed him on her way to the kitchen. "Just some work I've been catching up on," she replied, keeping her tone light. Victor smirked. "You don't have to do that anymore, you know? I told you. I've got us covered." Amara paused, glancing back at him. "You know, Victor, sometimes I think you underestimate me." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he chuckled. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You have no idea." That evening, Amara confronted Victor with what she'd overheard, testing his reaction. "Who's Lawrence Halstead, really?" she asked over dinner, her tone casual. Victor frowned, his fork pausing mid-air. "Why are you asking about him again?" "I've just been curious," she said, swirling her wine. "He seems important. You trust him a lot, don't you? Just be careful who you trust, Victor. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who do the most damage." Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As the tension between them thickened, Amara knew she had planted the seed of doubt. The next day, Amara followed up on a hunch. She requested access to Victor's company accounts, under the pretense of wanting to learn more about his business. Predictably, Victor waved her off, saying, "Leave the boring stuff to the experts." But Halstead, unaware of her true intentions, was more accommodating. Every piece of evidence she uncovered painted a clearer picture of Halstead's manipulations and Victor's obliviousness to it all. But one file stopped her cold. It wasn't just financial discrepancies anymore. Halstead had ties to offshore accounts linked to illegal dealings, potentially criminal activity on an international scale. Amara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a corporate scandal. If she exposed this, the fallout could destroy Victor, Halstead, and the entire company. As dawn broke, Amara sat back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. She had crossed a line she could never return from. The secrets she now carried were dangerous, but she couldn't turn back. Victor had used her as a pawn in his game, but now the game was hers to control. Amara's discovery weighed heavily on her as she made her way through the penthouse that morning. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was treading a dangerous line. Halstead wasn't just a corporate manipulator. He was involved in illegal activities that went far beyond siphoning funds. If she exposed him, it wouldn't just ruin Victor. It could make her a target. Her thoughts were interrupted by Victor's voice from the living room. "You've been keeping secrets, haven't you?" Amara froze. Had he discovered what she'd been doing? She turned slowly to find Victor leaning against the back of the couch, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, keeping her tone measured. Victor smirked, but there was no humor in his expression. "You've been poking around my company. I've had people watching you." Amara's stomach tightened. She hadn't been as discreet as she thought, but instead of panicking, she stepped closer, lifting her chin. "Maybe I was curious. You married me, but you never told me the full story of what I was stepping into." Victor's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of frustration. "You had no right to dig through my business. And you had no right to make me the punchline of your joke," Amara shot back. "But here we are." The room fell silent. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Victor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do you think you found?" Amara hesitated. Should she reveal what she knew? Halstead's scheme was Victor's blind spot, but could she trust him to act on it? Her instincts told her she couldn't handle this alone, no matter how much she wanted to. "Your trusted Lawrence Halstead," she said carefully, "isn't who you think he is. He's been embezzling funds and using your company to cover his tracks. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." Victor's expression shifted, skepticism clouding his features. "He's laundering money, Victor. And if you don't stop him, it's going to come back on you." Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the screen. Slowly, the weight of her words began to sink in. "If this gets out, it won't just ruin you," Amara interrupted. "It'll take down your employees, your shareholders, everyone who depends on this company." For the first time, Victor looked genuinely shaken. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. "What do you want me to do?" Amara hesitated. This was the moment where trust, or the lack of it, could change everything. "We need to stop him before he finalizes the merger," she said. "I overheard him talking about it. That's where everything will come to a head." Victor stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Fine, but we do this my way." The next day, Victor arranged a meeting with Halstead, claiming it was to discuss the merger. Amara insisted on being present, though Victor balked at the idea. "You're not coming," he said as they prepared to leave. "Yes, I am," Amara replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I've come this far. I'm not backing down now." Victor gave her a long look before relenting. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." The meeting was held in a sleek, high-rise conference room. Halstead greeted Victor with his usual charm, but the moment his eyes landed on Amara, his expression shifted. "This is unexpected," Halstead said smoothly, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "The accounts," Amara repeated, her gaze steady. "The ones tied to your shell companies. You didn't think we'd find those?" Victor crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain, Lawrence?" Halstead's mask cracked. He glanced between Victor and Amara, his composure faltering. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about." "Save it," Amara said sharply. She pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "Everything you need to know is in there. And before you try to deny it, just remember, I have copies." The room fell silent. Halstead's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, Victor stood abruptly. "You've got two options," Victor said, his voice icy. Either you resign quietly and let me clean up this mess, or I turn this over to the authorities and let them deal with you." Halstead glared at him, but the defeat in his eyes was unmistakable. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming out. As the door closed behind him, Victor turned to Amara. For the first time, his expression held something resembling gratitude. "You just saved my company," he admitted grudgingly. Amara didn't smile. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over." The days following Halstead's departure were chaotic. Victor and Amara worked together, poring over the mess Halstead had left behind. There has to be a keystone document or account that ties everything together. If we can trace it, we can shut this down before it's too late. Victor stopped pacing, rubbing his temples. "I've already put my legal team on it, but they're coming up empty." "Then we need to think like Halstead," Amara replied. Her voice was steady, but the weight of their task hung heavily between them. "He knew you trusted him completely. He would have hidden it somewhere he thought you'd never look." Victor glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You think you know him better than I do?" "I know what greed looks like," Amara said simply. The breakthrough came late that night. Amara was scanning an archive of old contracts when a single line item caught her attention, an obscure shell company listed as a consultant. "I've never even heard of this company." "Exactly," Amara said, her voice tinged with urgency. "Halstead's been funneling money through this account to finalize the merger. If we follow this thread, we can unravel the whole scheme." The next morning, Victor arranged a meeting with the board of directors. Amara insisted on joining him, despite his initial resistance. The directors, an intimidating group of seasoned executives, greeted them with skeptical eyes. Victor didn't waste time. "We've uncovered evidence that the merger is based on fraudulent data," he began, his voice firm. "It's a setup orchestrated by Lawrence Halstead." The room erupted in murmurs. One of the directors, an older man with a stern expression, raised his hand. "Do you have proof of these allegations?" Amara stepped forward, her calm confidence cutting through the noise. "We do," she said, placing a folder on the table. "This contains a detailed report of the financial discrepancies, along with the trail leading directly to Halstead's shell company." The directors reviewed the evidence, their expressions shifting from doubt to shock as the full scope of Halstead's scheme became clear. "If we proceed with this merger," Amara continued, "it will not only devastate the company but implicate every one of you as accomplices. This is your chance to stop it before it's too late." Just as the board began to deliberate, the door burst open, and Halstead stormed in, flanked by two of his cronies. His face was a mask of fury. "You think you can destroy me?" he snarled, his eyes darting between Victor and Amara. "You destroyed yourself," Victor shot back. Halstead's composure snapped. He lunged toward Victor, his voice rising in anger. "You're nothing without me. You wouldn't last a day in this business without someone like me cleaning up your messes." Before anyone could react, Halstead grabbed Amara by the arm, his grip bruising. "And you," he hissed, "you think you're clever? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Amara's calm broke, fear flashing in her eyes as she struggled to pull away. Victor stepped forward, his voice icy. "Let her go, Halstead." When Halstead didn't release her, Victor surged forward, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him away from Amara. The two men clashed, toppling a chair as they grappled. Amara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She reached for her phone and dialed security. Within moments, guards burst into the room, pulling Halstead away. As they escorted him out, Halstead spat over his shoulder. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." The room fell silent as the doors closed behind him. Victor turned to Amara, his breathing heavy. "Are you okay?" Amara nodded, though her hands trembled. "I'm fine." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the stern-faced director stood. "We need to convene immediately to assess the next steps. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Victor and Amara left the room together, their shared silence heavy with relief and exhaustion. Back at the penthouse, Victor poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. "You could have been hurt," he said quietly. Amara sat across from him, her gaze steady. "So could you. But we stopped him." Victor looked at her, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do this, you know. You could have walked away. Amara smiled faintly. Maybe. As she sifted through emails and old family records Victor had shared to help clear his company's name, a pattern began to emerge. Halstead hadn't been acting alone. One evening, as Victor returned from yet another grueling day at the office, Amara was waiting for him in the living room. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. Victor sighed, sinking into the couch. "Please tell me this isn't more bad news." "That depends," Amara replied, holding up a printed email. "Did you know your mother was in contact with Halstead?" Victor froze, his hand gripping the edge of the couch. "What are you talking about?" Amara handed him the email. "I found this in your archived family records. Your mother's name is all over the accounts Halstead was using to launder money. She wasn't just aware of what he was doing, she orchestrated it." Victor's face paled as he scanned the document. His voice was quiet, but laced with disbelief. "Why would she do this?" Amara's gaze softened. "I think it was personal. Halstead wasn't just trying to destroy your company. He was helping your mother cut you out of the picture entirely." Victor stood abruptly, pacing the room. "That doesn't make sense. She's always been controlling, sure. But this is..." He trailed off, his hands running through his hair. "Think about it," Amara pressed gently. "She never approved of you taking over the company. She always believed you weren't ready. And marrying me? That probably pushed her over the edge." Victor stopped pacing, his shoulders tense. This whole thing, the marriage, the humiliation, the sabotage, it was all part of her plan. Amara nodded. "She didn't just want to destroy your reputation. She wanted to prove you didn't deserve to lead. And Halstead was her perfect ally." Victor's expression hardened, a mix of anger and determination settling over him. "She underestimated me. She underestimated us." "What are you going to do?" Amara asked quietly. Victor's gaze met hers, steel in his eyes. "End this. For good." Victor stood outside his mother's sprawling estate, the weight of Amara's revelation still heavy on his shoulders. The grand iron gates loomed before him, as imposing as the woman who had raised him. Beside him, Amara's presence was a steadying force, though she hadn't wanted to come. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Victor nodded, his jaw tight. It's time she faced the consequences. No more games. They stepped through the gates together, the path leading to a confrontation that had been years in the making. Victor's mother, Evelyn Harrington, was seated in her ornate parlor, sipping tea as though nothing in the world could trouble her. She looked up as they entered, her expression cool and unreadable. "Victor," she said, her voice as polished as ever. "And Amara, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Victor wasted no time. "Cut the act, mother. I know everything. About Halstead, the accounts, and your plan to sabotage me." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. "Sabotage? That's a strong word." "It's the truth," Victor shot back, his voice rising. "You didn't think I was fit to run the company, so you tried to ruin me. And Amara? She was just collateral damage to you, wasn't she?" Evelyn set her teacup down with deliberate precision. "Victor, you've always been impulsive, reckless even. I did what I thought was necessary to protect the legacy your father and I built." Her gaze flicked to Amara. "Marrying her was the final straw. You couldn't possibly expect me to stand by while you jeopardized everything." Amara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You underestimated him. You underestimated both of us. Your plan failed." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't think for a moment that you've won. You may have uncovered my involvement, but the damage is done. The board will never trust Victor again." Victor took a step closer, his voice steely. "You're wrong. The board already knows the truth about Halstead, and soon, they'll know your part in it too. You might have built the foundation of this company, but I'll make sure its downfall is tied to your name, not mine." For the first time, Evelyn faltered. Her gaze moved between Victor and Amara, the weight of her miscalculations sinking in. Finally, she sighed, her voice weary. "Fine, you've made your point. But don't think for a second that this absolves you of your mistakes. Victor turned to leave, Amara at his side. As they reached the door, he glanced back. This isn't about absolution. It's about doing what's right, something you seem to have forgotten. The drive back to the city was silent, the tension in the car slowly dissipating. Amara finally broke the quiet. That was intense. Victor exhaled, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. It needed to be done. She nodded, glancing out the window. What happens now? Victor hesitated, then said, I rebuild. The company, my reputation, everything. And I do it right this time. Amara studied him for a moment, a small smile playing on her lips. You're not the same man I met at that party. Victor chuckled, though there was no humor in it. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. It is, Amara said softly. Trust me. The next few months brought dramatic change. Victor dedicated himself to repairing the damage Halstead and his mother had caused. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the company's reputation, focusing on ethical practices and transparency. Amara, meanwhile, poured her energy into growing her own business, which flourished under her newfound confidence and connections. Though they worked in parallel, their paths often crossed. Shared moments of quiet understanding and mutual respect began to replace the tension that had once defined their relationship. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of Victor's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below, Victor broke the silence. You could have walked away, he said, his voice low. After everything I put you through, you had every reason to leave. Amara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. I could have, but I didn't. Because deep down, I knew you weren't the man you were pretending to be. Victor met her gaze, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. Thank you. For everything. Amara smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. There's still work to do. Victor chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. Then let's get to it.